Hi, this is Dr. JP. As I'm recording this, it is April 23rd, and today just happens to be William Shakespeare's birthday/death day. He definitely died on this day in 1616, and based on his baptismal records, we believe he was born on April 23rd as well. Whether it's true or not, we like to think so. It adds a nice symmetry to the life of Shakespeare, and we, as Shakespeare scholars, early modern scholars, actually don't know a whole lot about Shakespeare. He's kind of a mystery, and so we tend to cling on to this whole birthday thing. So, in honor of Shakespeare's birthday, here's lecture 2 in the three lecture series on The Tempest. This lecture is on Ariel and Caliban. We're also going to touch on critical race studies and post-colonial studies as they relate to The Tempest just a little bit. We'll talk more about that in lecture 3. If you have questions, please send them to me, whether you're my student or not. I'm on Instagram at HeyDrJP. Before I actually move into slides, what I'm going to do is show you this really wonderful collection of images available through the folder library. I'll click here so that you can see the whole URL. I'll also include it below. But this is Luna. This is an image collection. It's available to everyone through the folder library. And what I'm going to do is to search for Ariel. And then after that, I'm going to search for Caliban. So Ariel brings up 89 images. I'm just going to zoom in a bit here. And you can see that some of these are book illustrations. Some of them are costume illustrations or production images. Here's Ariel as a harpy up here in the corner. We'll talk more about Ariel as a harpy soon. I'm just scrolling down the page to show you sort of the wide array of ways that people have thought about Ariel. We're looking at images because this lecture is about how we think about Ariel and Caliban as potential non-human subjects in The Tempest. Both Ariel and Caliban are depicted in terms of monstrosity within the text. Caliban specifically says that he is not human. Ariel specifically says that he is not human. I'm looking at Caliban, trying to talk about Ariel. And he's speaking to Prospero when he says this. This is in Act 5. He says, like, I would feel bad for these people were a human. You can see here depictions of Caliban throughout time. You can see that sometimes he's portrayed as dark, other times he isn't, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. But this sort of hairy, monstrous, misshapen creature is supported by the text, as we'll see in just a moment. So the last lecture, we spoke a little bit about the first folio. This is the first published edition of The Tempest. This is where we begin. We also talked a little bit about William Strachey's letter in 1610 about a shipwreck that inspired Shakespeare. And in that letter, there was a mention of the fact that people thought the Bermuda Islands were Devil's Islands. They thought that they were magical and scary. And what Strachey says is like, actually, no, this was a great place for us to land. If we had to land somewhere, this was awesome. But the stigma around the islands sort of persisted as they're a magical place. So why am I bringing up Strachey again? Why are we talking about this when we're talking about Caliban and Ariel? The Tempest is a play fundamentally about early modern empire, and that includes colonization, globalization, and the transatlantic slave trade. England, as you know, being mostly Americans and or citizens of places that Britain colonized. Um, Colonization was a huge project for England. Strachey's ship that wrecked was on its way to the Virginia colony at the time. Um, the Virginia Company is part of what funded Shakespeare's patron and therefore Shakespeare's work. So English colonization and empire is a huge part of what's going on here in the early modern period. The Tempest was first performed in 1611, so that's the timing that we're in. Globalization is also important because the world is becoming more and more connected. There were outposts all around the world. You could get very easily from Asia into Europe at this point. There were forays into Africa, and by forays I mean both exploration and exploitation. And that took the form of the transatlantic slave trade, of which England was a participant. So, keeping all of these things in mind, I want us to go to the text briefly, and to have a look at some context within the Tempest that make us think about empire. So first is the King of Naples sea journey in and of itself. We see in Act 1, Scene 1 that these people, including the king, are on a sea voyage, but we're not really sure why. We learn in Act 2, Scene 1 that they have gone to Africa to marry off the king's daughter to a prince there. And marriages were very much a part of nation building and globalization and relationship building. And so the fact that this was a marriage journey and not an exploratory journey doesn't make it any less about empire and colonization and globalization. Also, the people in the king's party sort of loudly complain about the fact that he's had to marry his daughter off to a person from Africa. They're a little upset about this. Kings were often explorers in the early modern period, and so this should also bring that up. We also have Antonio's political machinations. He threw his brother Prospero out of Italy, out of Milan, and he is also planning with his cronies on the island to take the place of the king in Naples, to damage his current ruler. And these political machinations are also wound up in power and empire. Ariel's errands should remind us of the global context of the play as well. The lines I've cited here are when he talks about going to the still vexed Bermudes or the Bermudas to gather dew. The origin of Sycorax, Caliban's mother, is also something that should make us think of a global context for the play. Sycorax is from Argier in the play. It's Algier, and she's not native to the island where the Tempest takes place. She is sent there as a sort of banishment or punishment, and there she bears her son Caliban. Gonzalo also has this vision of a utopian plantation upon the island. In Act 2, Scene 1, in the lines I've noted here, he talks about how he would govern the island if it were his to govern. He says basically like nobody would work, everything would be awesome. But the thing you need to remember about utopia is that the word itself is a pun. We think of it as a good place, right? Topos is place. EU in Greek is good, right? A good place. But that U could also be OU in Greek, which stands for no place. So a utopia is perfect, but it also doesn't exist. Finally, there are multiple mentions of servitude and slavery throughout the text of the Tempest. I've just outlined 200 or so lines of that here in Act 1, Scene 2, but it lasts throughout the play over and over. So, our two servants in the play, for the most part, are Ariel and Caliban. They're the first two servants we meet, absolutely, aside from the king's retainers. And they highlight different pieces of all of this concern the play has with empire and globalization and servitude and everything else like that. They also highlight different things about monstrosity that my students are going to be particularly interested in a class called Monsters and Outcasts. So we'll start with Ariel. No matter where we set the play, no matter what our critical lens, our ideas of these characters of Ariel and Caliban are based in the perceptions and descriptions of other people. Okay. The first description of Ariel we really get, besides spirit, right, from Prospero's mouth, is this one from Ariel. He says, I come to answer thy best pleasure, be it to fly, to swim, to dive into the fire, to ride on the curled clouds, to thy strong bidding task, Ariel and all his quality. So Ariel has portrayed himself as a part of nature here. Air, earth, fire, and water. He's part of all of that here. He is ready to answer. He can fly, he can swim, he can dive, he can ride. He is going to take care of it. Okay, he's a consummate servant. Now, Prospero and Ariel get into, as you know, like a little tiff, a little argument, because Prospero wants Ariel to do more work, and Ariel says, like, hey, you said you were going to free me, right? So Prospero answers that by saying, like, have you forgotten where you came from, right? Ariel says, no, I haven't forgotten. And Prospero says, thou dost, and thinks it much to tread the ooze of the salt deep, to run upon the sharp wind of the north, to do me business in the veins of the earth when it is baked with frost. I've put this here because it's not so much about the argument that they have, but about what Ariel is capable of doing, right? He can do lots of really cool stuff. Prospero also tells us more about Ariel by telling us where he found him. Thou, my slave, as thou reports thyself, was then her servant, her being Sycorax. And for thou wast a spirit too delicate, that period shouldn't be there, to act her earthy and abhorred commands, refusing her grand hess, it should say. Autocorrect is getting me in these quotes. She did confine thee into a cloven pine, within which rift imprisoned thou didst painfully remain. So here we have a couple of different things about Ariel. First, he's too delicate to act the earthy and abhorred commands that Sycorax is asking of him, and so she traps him. Where does she trap him? In a tree. Okay, so his natural jail is part of his character as well. We often think of, well, maybe not you, but people who think about nymphs and fairies and things like that often associate them with nature, and so the fact that he was imprisoned in a tree seems pretty normal. Speaking of nymphs, here Prospero says that he should make himself like a nymph of the sea, be subject to no sight but thine and mine, invisible to every eyeball else. And again, the periods after subject and invisible should not be there. I don't know why they're there. Take the shape, he says. Shape is another word that's really important for thinking about Ariel. Ariel is also a singer. I spoke a little bit about the Blackfriars in in the last lecture, the first part of the last lecture, and the children of the Blackfriars. The children at Blackfriars often sang and tumbled and did sort of the gymnastic type routines. And Ariel was likely played by a young boy who had a lovely singing voice. And so Shakespeare took advantage of that in The Tempest. And we have the songs for this play. Often with plays that have singing, we don't have the songs, but we do for The Tempest. Um, and so this leads people to believe that Shakespeare wrote them, and it also leads people to believe that they're the original, natural, real songs for the play. The fact that Ariel sings just tells us more about his character. His singing is alluring, his singing is powerful, and he also sings about himself. You can see the sweet sprites here. Uh, Ariel continues to be associated with music in Act 2. He enters invisible playing solemn music, and he enters with music and song. And Caliban in Act 2 is afraid of spirits. Ariel is just one of the spirits that Prospero commands. So when Ariel is coming in Act 2, there are other spirits around as well. Caliban in Act 2, Scene 2 is afraid, and so he dives onto the beach and covers himself with a cloak, right? We'll talk more about that in a moment, but he's afraid because he thinks that a spirit like Ariel, maybe including Ariel, might come to torment him. Stefano and Trinculo are also afraid of Ariel because he's an invisible musician. Like, what is this? Like, who is playing this song, this picture of nobody? And so Stefano says, if thou beest a man, show thyself in thy likeness. If thou beest a devil, take it as thou list, right? Like, you know, do what you want with me, just leave me alive, right? He doesn't really know what to think of this invisible player. In 3-2, Caliban isn't afraid of the noises that he hears. And again, this is reflecting back on Ariel and the other spirits, the other shapes on the island. Caliban says in one of the most lovely speeches in all of Shakespeare's work, "Be not afeared. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then, in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again." He's telling Stefano and Trinculo about the island. The island is full of noises, right? Ariel is a source of one of these noises. And you can tell that because of these lines about sleep, right? When Ariel plays music, when Ariel whispers in someone's ear, they fall asleep, they wake up. There's more music here, solemn and strange music, and then enter Prospero on the top of the stage here, invisible, with several strange shapes, right? This is the banquet in 3-3, where the food comes and goes, right? And Ariel comes in like a harpy, his wings on the table, and the banquet vanishes from the castaways. They're stuck on a desert island and food appears before them. They want to eat it, right? But as soon as they convince themselves to do it, Ariel comes in like a harpy and deletes the food, right? He takes it away. So this is a harpy. This is an illustration in our Folger Shakespeare Library edition of The Tempest. And I've just put it here for you for convenience. So this is what a harpy looks like. It's sort of half bird with the head of a man. A harpy is mean, right? And it comes from this book called The Prodigiorum, right? The prodigies are monstrous. So a little earlier in 3-3, when Gonzalo is in awe of the shapes that have appeared, the food that has appeared before him, he says, like, would we have believed, basically, before, when we were young, we wouldn't have believed what's happening to us now. When we were boys, who would believe that there were mountaineers dew-lapped like bulls whose throats had hanging at 'em wallets of flesh or wattles? Or that there were such men whose heads stood in their breasts? He says, like, these are things we didn't believe, but people say they're true. these things are true as well, these things that are happening to us on the island. So these men with heads that stood in their breasts might sound a little familiar to you, and if you were flipping through your print folder edition, you came across this image, which should definitely be familiar. This is again from the Prodigiorum, but you've seen it in Isidore of Seville's Etymologiae, right? The Blemmyans in Libya are born as trunks without heads, having their mouth and eyes in their chest, and that another race is born without necks, blah, blah, blah. You've also seen the Blimmyi in the Wonders of the East, back when we were talking about Beowulf and the Wonders of the East in the Noel Codex and Cotton Vitellius. There's another island south of the Brixantes on which there are born men without heads who have eyes and mouth in their chests. They're 8 feet tall and 8 feet wide. And you can see the image of them from the Wonders of the East in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. So we have Ariel and Caliban, but we also have mention of these other fairly well-known monstrous beings in the early modern period. Isidore of Seville was a widely circulated text. We talked about this before. The Prodigiorum that the Folger is using was also a widely circulated text. There were other Liber Monstrorum, or books of monsters, circulating. We've talked about Ambrose Pare's Book of Prodigies. We've talked about Montaigne and his essays that include subjects like cannibals, for which, if you think, Caliban sounds like cannibal, you're right. It's an anagram for cannibal. So we're going to move now to talk more about Caliban, but before we do, I want to just mention that this talk of monsters in general is supposed to reflect back on these two characters that seem differently human than the others in the play. So here we're going to talk about Caliban, and again, we're dealing in perception and descriptions from other characters. So Prospero says, before we meet Caliban on stage, then was this island safe for the son that Sycorax did litter here, a freckled whelp, hag-born, not honored with a human shape. Now, punctuation is a little bit difficult in Shakespeare. I did not pull up the folio. I will link that page in the description of the video below. But it's, when you're looking at your own edition, right, how do you know whether the parenthetical is meant to be there? How do you know whether the parenthetical would be heard on stage, right? We can speak a parenthetical like, but, right? But it's difficult to know how this is going to come through. So grammatically, Prospero is saying, then was this island not honored with a human shape, except for Caliban, right? The son that Sycorax did litter here. But he's using animal language to talk about Caliban, the word litter, the word whelp, right? These are words that we would associate with animals rather than with people. And so not honored with a human shape can also cling on to that description of Caliban. Here's another exchange between Prospero and Miranda. We'll visit Caliban, my slave, who never yields us kind answer, says Prospero. Miranda says, 'Tis a villain, sir, I do not love to look on. Prospero, but as 'tis, we cannot miss him. He does make our fire, fetch in our wood, and serves in offices that profit us. What ho, slave, Caliban, thou earth, thou, speak. I put this in because Prospero calls Caliban a slave twice in less than 10 lines, and he's called a villain. They also talk about how useful he is to him. Like, we can't do without him. He's pretty useful, right? And then in this last line, thou earth, thou, speak. Caliban is associated with the earth itself rather than with humanity. He's associated with dirt, the stuff that you walk on, rather than someone with a soul and with thoughts. Here again, thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dam, come forth, right? Damn is a word that, again, people would use for animals rather than for people. And he's called a poisonous slave, got by the devil. Thou most lying slave, says Prospero, whom stripes may move, not kindness. I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care, and lodged thee in my own cell, till thou, that should say didst, seek to violate the honor of my child. Prospero has said here, I took good care of you, right? But you tried to rape my daughter. Now, if this is true, Caliban is terrible, right? He should not try to rape Miranda. It's not okay, right? Like, me too, Shakespeare. There's a whole set of scholarship about this. However, it's Prospero telling us this story, and Prospero may not be the most reliable narrator of past events. So that's something to keep in mind. Caliban does say that he regrets the fact that he didn't sleep with Miranda or rape her, because else he would have peopled the island with Calibans. But that's again, he's under the thumb of a master, and we don't know exactly what's going on. Here we have Trinculo's description of Caliban. What have we here? A man or a fish, dead or alive? A fish. He smells like a fish. A very ancient and fish-like smell, a kind of nut of the newest, poor John, a strange fish. Were I in England now, says Trinculo, as I once was, and I had but this fish painted, and your book gives you the note like painted on a sign, right? Not a holiday fool there, but would give me a piece of silver. This whole section is about people paying to see spectacles in England. You could charge money to see a deformed child or a radically disabled person sort of just doing everyday tasks. People also paid money to see people of color from Africa, to see people whom they called at that point blackamoors. And so these sites were lucrative. Here's Stefano talking about Caliban and Trinculo put together a little bit, right? Because I should say here, back with Trinculo, this is when Caliban is hiding under that cloak, and that's what makes him think that Caliban's a monster at first, right? So he says he's legged like a man and has fins like arms. That fins stuff is coming from the cloak. And then he says later he's warm, and this is no fish, but an islander that has lately suffered by a thunderbolt. Then Trinculo gets scared because he hears Stefano singing. So Stefano comes up and says, oh, what have we here, right? What's the matter? Do you put tricks upon us with savages and men of Ind or India? Ha! I have not scraped drowning to be feared now of your 4 legs. So he's talking about the legs of Trinculo sticking out one way and the legs of Caliban sticking out the other. He calls this the most delicate monster. Even once he's found out that it's 2 separate people under this cloak, he still refers to Caliban as a mooncalf, meaning a monster swayed by the ebbing and the phases of the moon. Trinculo goes on and on and on and on and on about how monstrous Caliban is in 2:2. Monster, 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 monster. Prospero in 4 picks up and talks about, he's saying this sort of to himself. He sent Ariel off to grab Caliban and Trinculo and Stefano and pull them over to steal the shiny clothes. And this is what he says about Caliban while Ariel is gone. A devil, a born devil, on whose nature nurture can never stick. You can't teach him, right? One of the conflicts in the play is the fact that Miranda and Caliban have tried to teach, Miranda and Prospero have tried to teach Caliban They've taught him language, for instance. Miranda says, like, I taught you how to speak. And Caliban says, my profit on the fact that you taught me how to speak is that I know how to curse you. I wish that you had never taught me how to speak, but since you did, I'll curse you with your speech. This impulse to teach or to civilize indigenous peoples that are being colonized is a big one, and one you should be familiar with your studies through history. Stefano, Trinculo, and Caliban are the subject of this speech as well, by Prospero in 5:1. Mark but the majesty of these men, my lords, then say if they be true. This misshapen knave, speaking of Caliban, his mother was a witch, and one so strong that could control the moon, make flows and ebbs, and deal in her command without her power. These three have robbed me, and this demi-devil, again, Caliban, for he's a bastard one, he's a bastard devil, had plotted with them, these other two, to take my life. Two of these fellows you must know and own. This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. This phrase, this thing of darkness, is a sticking point for a lot of scholars about this play. Many scholars believe that The Tempest is about race, and I definitely agree. If you are interested in reading about race in The Tempest as well as in just early modern theater in general, I would recommend a book by Kim F. Hall called Things of Darkness, and I will link that in the description of the video below. The last section of text that I'm going to talk about with regard to Caliban is this exchange between Alonso and Prospero. Alonso says, this is as strange a thing as e'er I looked on, and he's indicating Caliban. And Prospero says he is disproportioned in his manners as in his shape. So in our course on monstrosity and on outcasts, Ariel and Caliban, I think, fit both categories in different ways. Ariel seems much more at home with servitude. Caliban doesn't seem to fit in at all with the life that Prospero has made on the island. He may have done in the past, but does not now. Prospero seems to say that Caliban has gotten worse with age. Ariel is unhappy that he does not have his freedom, yet he is still a willing and able servant. It's hard to tell at what point Caliban is a racialized other versus an outcast. Those two things might be the same thing, right? Our definitions of outcast and our definitions of monster overlap quite a bit in our course. We've discussed this many times, and so I'm not going to cite particular examples of our speeches to you, but we've talked about the fact that both of those categories are based in our definitions of humanity. What counts, who counts, how we count them. And so as you continue to think about Ariel and Caliban in this play, I want to encourage you to continue to think about depictions of monstrosity versus or in addition to humanity. If Caliban is a monster, right? If you truly believe he's misshapen, if he's not quite human, since he's supposed to have been begotten by the devil and a witch, right? Then you're reading kind of a different play than a lot of other people are reading, okay? Your interpretations are valid. I'm not saying that they're not. They are based in text, as we've said already. But not everyone is going to be reading the play the same way you are. That's the thing about Shakespeare. There are lots of different ways to read it, and all of them can be based in the text. The Tempest is definitely about empire and colonization, right? But it's hard to say where the text itself lands there. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's productive ambiguity, right? On the one hand, and I'm speaking mostly about Caliban here, on the one hand, the play seems to endorse Prospero's views of Caliban. At the end, Caliban even says, like, oh, I'm going to be better after this. I'll never follow some drunken fool again, right? Um, I'll get back in good graces. I'll do my job, right? He seems to have learned at the end of the play. And that seems to endorse everything that Prospero has said about him. At the same time, um, Caliban as a caricature of an indigenous person could be meant to critique that caricature, right? So it's difficult to say where the play stands on the issue of colonization and empire. The non-specificity of the geography encourages us to think across empires, not just England, but other European empires as well, and across colonial contexts, not just the Americas, which is where England was really focused, but also Africa and the islands of the Caribbean and so forth, and other places around the world as well. Um, Caliban himself is not native to the island where the Tempest takes place, and that's also important to remember. He is difficult to pin down as well. He's put forth as an object of fear. Prospero depicts him as a rapist, right? He's a strange sight. But all of the dehumanization that Prospero and the other characters throw at Caliban, for me anyway, dehumanizes them just as much. And so I don't know if it would have read that way for Shakespeare's audience originally, in 1611, but it reads that way for me now. Non-white skin was often seen as a physical defect or a curiosity to be fetishized, as we said before. And the indigenous peoples are often depicted as barbarous. That is, etymologically, not able to speak Latin, right? Barbar is how is the sound of babbling that barbarians made to the Romans, right? Barbarian is a Roman term and a Latin term. And so to depict indigenous people as barbaric is pretty normal. But as I said earlier, Caliban has one of the most beautiful speeches in The Tempest for sure, and in I think a lot of Shakespeare's work. So it's important to think about. Along with these things, monstrosity, humanity, servitude, and empire, Ariel and Caliban help us to think about the supernatural, which is something that we haven't really talked about a lot in our class. We've been focused on science and natural phenomena, I guess. But the supernatural is just as important to monsters and outcasts as anything else. So the next lecture is going to be on other critical lenses that we can use to read The Tempest. And these include, but are not limited to, feminism, eco-criticism. We'll talk a little bit about science and magic and the supernatural as well. And a few other things as well as theater history, race and post-colonial contexts. And, I'll probably touch on monstrosity again. So send me your questions. Again, I'm on Instagram at HeyDrJP, and I want to wish you a very happy, happy, happy Shakespeare birthday, death day.